Hello and welcome to the Papal Shenanigans podcast, where we will cover various ridiculous things about the medieval Catholic Church and its popes. Before we get started with our episode, I would like to give a quick disclaimer that the negativity towards some popes in this episode is not overall reflective of mine own or Columbus High School's views on the modern Catholic Church, its pope, or its followers. Without further ado, let's get started with our first episode about Celestine V and the story of papal abdication. Hello. Before we can get started discussing the particular popes of the medieval Catholic Church, we first have to establish what exactly is a pope and how does somebody become the holiest dude in the Catholic Church? Well, what is a pope? Essentially, according to the Catholic faith, a long time ago, God designated some people as the successors of Jesus' apostles. One of these successors was the Bishop of Rome, aka the Pope. So there were a lot of these other bishops of a bunch of different places, but they don't matter for this podcast. The only one we're concerned about is the Bishop of Rome, which later became the Pontifex Maximus, aka the Pope. God designated these successor positions of the apostles as lifelong positions, meaning they were supposed to be filled for someone's entire life, almost like court justices on the U.S. Supreme Court. Spoiler alert, in a couple hundred years when there are popes who do want to quit, this will become very controversial with some diehard Catholics. I am not qualified to answer that very much ongoing religious debate, but no, it does happen. Now in this podcast, we will be most specifically addressing the period from 754 AD to 1870 AD. That is because during that period is when all the ridiculous stuff involving the Pope happens. The reason the ridiculous stuff happens in that period as opposed to any other time is because during that period the area around the Vatican was known as the Papal States, where essentially the Pope functioned not only as a religious leader to the entirety of the Catholic world, but also as functionally a king to the area around Rome. Obviously being the overall religious authority to most of the world, and a literal king to some, is obviously a very important job, and we got to make sure that we get the right person for that job. So how do we do it? Nowadays it's done by a process known as the Papal Conclave. You know, the white smoke, the black smoke, the gray smoke, all of that, where it's essentially a whole televised event in the Vatican electing the new pope. Back then it wasn't really that. It was mostly the most powerful families in Italy getting together and deciding who was going to be the next pope. Very corrupt, very not cool, but it happened that way anyway. Now during this period, somebody could become pope by being elected by the College of Cardinals or the Papal Conclave, or they could become pope by being appointed pope by the Holy Roman Emperor, that is to say the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, which was Germany. Not anywhere near Rome, it was just Germany. For very complicated historical reasons, just Germany. Just think of Germany. Because of this deeply personal element to the College of Cardinals being that they were just essentially the rich people of medieval Italy, you'll see that sometimes throughout the popes discussed in this podcast, they are chosen for very morally dubious and iffy and kind of corrupt reasons, or just because the College of Cardinals is lazy. That's what happens a lot of the time. So we've already discussed how being Pope is a pretty important job especially during this medieval period where not only again were you a religious leader, but you were also a governmental force in the world. Now let's take a look at a man who super didn't want to be either of these things. He didn't want to be a religious leader, and he certainly didn't want to have any governmental presence. A man by the name of Pietro Angelerio was born in 1215 in modern-day Molise, Italy. After his father's death, when he was only 17, Pietro decided he wanted to become a Benedictine monk at the city of Fafali. After a bit, he decided he wanted to follow his true hermetic heart and moved into a solitary cave in the mountain of Morone in his early 20s, where he got the name Pietro da Morone. It was during this time the previous pope, Nicholas IV, died. After 5 years, he moved to the mountain of Maia with 2 companions. During his 5-year tenure in the mountain of Maia, for 4 of those years, there was no pope. Because of the conflict within the cardinals, for 4 years after the death of Nicholas IV, nobody occupied the papal chair. Because of the disorder this caused, Pietro became very frustrated and sent a letter to the cardinals from the mountain of Maia, telling them that if they do not decide on a pope soon, all of the cardinals present will go to hell for slowing the word of God. The cardinals are so impressed by the gumption of this random monk in the backwater Italian mountains that they decide they want him to be the next pope. So yes, ladies and gentlemen, you can get hired by telling your boss to go to hell. It's kind of rare, but I mean, you can do it. The cardinals sent up some guards to Mountain of Maella to gather up his new eminence. When they arrived, Pietro really didn't want to be pope, so he locked himself in his little cell until his buddies, his companions, convinced him to come out and accept that God had chosen him to be pope and that he should never turn down this opportunity. Pietro thought it over for a while and decided eventually that yes, he would become pope. He would accept that God chose him to be pope. So he goes with the guards, they leave the mountain, and they get approximately 1 step down the mountain before Pietro books it. Pietro, after his escape attempt, lives in the Italian wilderness for a little bit before the guards eventually catch back up to him. And then he decides, you know what, I will actually go through with the whole being pope thing. He decides this for about 5 seconds before he tries to run away again. Then the guards catch back up to him, they recapture him. He's like, okay, fine, I'm ready to be pope. The guards are like, finally, we've just been trying to get you to be pope for the past 3 weeks while you've been chasing you around. He's like, okay, I'm finally ready to be pope. He says, I'm going to give my first papal decree. And they're like, oh, so he's actually ready to really do the job now. So he's sitting there and he says, I want to give my first decree. The guards are like, okay, your eminence, what is your first decree? He says, popes should be allowed to quit. They should be able to abdicate their position and not necessarily stop being pope, but let somebody else be pope in their stead for a while. The guards are like, okay, kind of a weird decree. You know, usually people don't want to give up the power of being pope, but I guess they should have the option. And Celestine goes, okay, now, are you ready for my second decree? And the guards are like, oh my gosh, he's really on board with it now. He's really going to do his job. They're like, yes, we're absolutely ready. Give us your second decree. He says, my second decree is that I, Pope Celestine V, quit. The guards are like, what? What do you mean you quit? And Pope Celestine V is like, I just kind of explained to you the system by which popes are now able to quit. And then I quit using that system. And the guards are like, I don't really know what to do with this. Now, the Papal States, once again, have no pope. They went 4 years without a pope, 4 years without a ruler. They finally got one, and then he quit. So So the Papal States at this point are obviously very desperate for a ruler that actually wants to be the ruler. So they look around, and they look at all the power-hungry people in the College of Cardinals, and they see this one cardinal, Cardinal Caetani, one of the cardinals who helped elect Celestine V. They say, "You, Caetani, you, kid, get over here." He's like, "Yeah?" And they're like, "You're the new pope." He's like, "Huh?" They're like, "You're the new pope. Celestine just quit. You're the new pope." Caetani goes, "What do you mean Celestine quit? Like, lifelong position and all that junk." And they're like, "I don't know how he did it, but he quit somehow." That's what the guards just told us. The guards just told us that he quit. Caetani goes, "Okay. My name is now Boniface VIII. And my first decree is that Celestine V needs to be immediately thrown in jail." And everybody around him goes, "Huh? You want to throw the Pope in jail?" And Boniface goes, "Yes. I want to throw the Pope in jail." And well, now Caetani is Pope Boniface VIII, so they can't really do anything to stop him from putting the previous Pope in jail. So they do. Now, this may seem completely crazy on Caetani's part to want to put Celestine in jail. However, considering that at the time it was a really common thing to, when somebody you didn't like was Pope, to try and put somebody else as Pope to oppose them, that was known as an anti-Pope. Considering that was really common at the time, the fact that Caetani was a little bit skeptical and thought that somebody might try to elect Celestine as an anti-pope to oppose him, it's actually not that unreasonable that he would put Celestine V in jail. Does it make it okay? No. But it's not that unreasonable. Now, forming our conclusions about Celestine V. Celestine V did almost nothing while he was pope. He had like 2 reforms that he did during the 2 months that he was pope. I have slightly under-exaggerated what he did. He, did more than just allowed popes to quit. He had some minor grain reforms. Boniface immediately undid those. So Celestine V essentially did nothing but allowed popes to quit. So it's not that unreasonable to think of the fact that a lot of Catholics don't really like Pope Celestine V. They feel like his process of papal abdication violates the sanctity of the papal chair. They feel like popes being able to quit shouldn't be a thing that's allowed. And Catholicism.org describes Celestine V as, quote, "a vastly saintly but wholly incompetent pope." Nobody thinks that Celestine V was a bad person. Nobody thinks he's a bad Christian. Most Catholics think he was a perfectly fine Benedictine monk, but he was a monk that should not have become pope. Since Pope Celestine V, no pope has taken the name Celestine. He is the last Celestine of the papal line as of yet, and he established the Celestinian order, essentially another hermetical order in the mountains of Italy of people just loving Jesus and writing books. That's essentially what the holy orders did. They loved Jesus and they wrote books. Now, the situation with papal abdication is very much an ongoing religious debate within the Catholic community. There has only been one other pope to ever voluntarily abdicate other than Pope Celestine V. That pope is Pope Benedict XVI, who took a voluntary abdication after a lot of backlash from him being in the Hitler Youth during World War II. That is very different from what Celestine V did. Celestine V quit being pope because he did not want to be pope. Pope Benedict XVI quit being pope because people were accusing him of being a Nazi, because he was in the Hitler Youth. Now, I will not provide my opinion on whether Pope Benedict XVI was actually a Nazi, but that is why he abdicated, was because people were accusing him of being a Nazi. His replacement was Pope Francis, the current pope, who virtually everyone agrees, great pope, great guy. Now, another important thing to discuss with the concept of papal abdication is the implication of that second word, abdication. Abdication is usually a word that is reserved for when somebody is giving up a throne of some kind. Now, there's obviously the world-famous chair of St. Peter that the Pope sits upon when giving his decrees. However, this is expressly not supposed to be a throne. The Pope is not supposed to be a kingly authority. The Pope is not supposed to have any kind of political rule over someone's life. The very word abdication, however, implies this throne. Implies that somebody is giving up a vast power. Now, popes definitely have a lot of religious authority. Most of the world is Catholic. However, are they kingly? Do they deserve a throne? That word of abdication has certainly sparked a lot of debate among Catholics and non-Catholics alike as to why that word in particular is used. Papal retirement could be what we would call it. But it's specifically abdication. It is specifically somebody stepping down from a throne to let someone else fill it. I will leave those implications up to you, the listener, as to what your opinions form on them. Without further ado, let's close this episode out. And that is all we have for you on this episode of the Papal Shenanigans podcast. Tune in 2 weeks from now on February 1st, 2022 to catch episode 2 about Boniface VIII and the transition to the Avignon papacy. Just be warned, it gets a little crazy. There's some robbery, there's some kidnapping, there's maybe a little bit of Pope murder. The best kind. This is your host, Lucas Lehman, signing off. Before we fully close out our podcast today, I would just like to give a special thanks to Dr. Julianne Gardner for helping me with the research throughout this podcast, and a special thanks to Mr. Victor Cross for helping me produce and record this podcast. Thank you very much to both of you. I could not have done this without you, and thank you for being some of the best teachers I have ever had in my entire life. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Papal Shenanigans podcast. Currently, we have no sponsors to remind you of, so I will just remind you that there will be some of my sources in the show notes. If you would like to go check this out, if any of this interests you, you can look down in the show notes for some of my sources. Once again, thank you to Dr. Julianne Garner and Mr. Victor Cross for help on this podcast. Again, episode 2 will be out 2 weeks from now on February 1st, 2022, talking about Boniface VIII and the transition to the Avignon papacy with Clement V. Thank you very much for your time. Hope to see you next episode. Goodbye.